Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, courage, and change. Today's story is about Jordan Edwards, a trailblazing pilot who defied the odds to expose the corruption and safety violations within one of America's oldest airlines. In a world where silence is often the easiest path, Jordan chose to stand up for what was right, risking her career and her safety to make sure others were not forgotten. Join us as we dive into her incredible journey, filled with determination, truth, and transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to start today's story with us. It was 5:17 a.m., and the early morning fog still clung to the tarmac at O'Hare International Airport. The sounds of pilots, ground crew, and the distant hum of jet engines filled the air. For Jordan Edwards, this wasn't just another day. This was her first day as a senior captain at Horizon Airlines, one of the most prestigious carriers in the country. The weight of that moment, the responsibility, and the sheer exhilaration of it all were almost too much to bear. But Jordan had learned long ago to rise to every challenge. She had earned her place, not only through her impeccable skills but by defying every barrier that had been placed in her way throughout her career. She had flown over 15,000 hours across the globe, from the bustling skies over London to the windswept airfields of Africa. She had served as a military transport pilot, flying across dangerous terrains in Afghanistan, and now, she was here, at the pinnacle of her civilian career. Her uniform, crisp and immaculate, fit her like a second skin. 4 gold stripes gleamed on her sleeves, catching the fluorescent light as she moved purposefully through the terminal, her pilot's case rolling quietly behind her. It was a ritual for her to take a deep breath as she prepared for her day. In the quiet moments before a flight, she could remind herself of the enormity of her responsibility. For Jordan, flying wasn't just a job, it was a sacred trust. People's lives rested in her hands. As she walked toward the crew lounge to grab some coffee, Jordan could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. Pilots and flight attendants paused their conversations just long enough to look her way, curiosity mixed with something else. It was something she'd become used to, though it still stung. Less than 1% of commercial airline pilots were black women. She'd been told she flew as if she was born with wings. But in those moments, those glances often reminded her of how rare her presence was. Inside the lounge, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the low hum of conversations swirled around her. She moved toward the coffee station, her mind already shifting to the briefing she would attend shortly. Jordan knew the flight path to New York well, had reviewed it countless times. Nothing felt out of the ordinary until a voice from behind interrupted her thoughts. "You must be Captain Edwards." Jordan turned to see a man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, extending his hand. His uniform also bore the 4 gold stripes of seniority. "Captain Mitchell," he said with a tight smile. "Welcome to Horizon." Jordan took his hand, a firm handshake, and smiled back. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be here." Mitchell nodded. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks," he said, though the words seemed more like an unspoken warning. There was something off in his tone, something that made Jordan's senses sharpen. "I trust you've reviewed the flight path for today?" "Of course," Jordan replied, her voice steady. "I've memorized the New York approach procedures and reviewed the weather patterns. We're expecting some turbulence over the Appalachians, but nothing out of the ordinary." Mitchell gave a curt nod. "Good. The crew is waiting in briefing room C. I'll meet you there in 5. As he walked away, Jordan felt the familiar knot in her stomach. She had learned over the years that part of being a pilot wasn't just about technical skill. It was about reading people, about understanding the unspoken words and the subtle shifts in body language. And Mitchell, with his tightly controlled expression and stiff demeanor, made her uneasy. Still, she pushed the discomfort aside. She had a job to do, and today, she would do it well. Inside the briefing room, the crew was already gathered, 6 flight attendants and her co-pilot, First Officer James Harris, who was smiling warmly as she walked in. "Captain Edwards," he said with a genuine grin. "I've heard great things about you. It's an honor to be flying with you today." Jordan returned his smile, grateful for his warmth. The pleasure's mine, James. Let's make it a smooth flight. Just as the group settled, the door opened again, and Thomas Barrett, the executive operations director, entered. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and the air of someone used to being in control. His gaze briefly flickered to Jordan before he turned to the group. There's been a change of plans, Barrett announced, his voice cutting through the room with surprising coldness. Captain Mitchell will be taking command of Flight 203 today. Jordan froze, her mind racing. She was scheduled for that flight, not Mitchell. She opened her mouth to speak, but Barrett's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. Captain Edwards, we need you to wait outside while we reassign you. The words hit her like a slap. It wasn't just the unexpected shift, but the implications, the way the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Watching, Jordan had been through enough in her career to know when something wasn't right. When the line between professional conduct and something else was being crossed. May I ask why? She asked, struggling to keep her voice even, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Barrett looked at her, then flicked his eyes toward Mitchell. There was something deliberate in his hesitation. It's a matter of experience, Barrett said flatly. New captains typically need to shadow more experienced crews, especially on flights with challenging approaches. Given your unfamiliarity with our protocols, it's better that you wait outside. Jordan's mind raced. She had flown into New York at least 50 times, in all types of weather conditions. Her qualifications were impeccable, her experience undeniable. This wasn't a question of her abilities, it was something more insidious. With as much dignity as she could muster, Jordan set her flight documents down on the table. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the request, but her anger simmered beneath the surface. This wasn't just a misstep. This was a message that, despite all her accomplishments, she was still an outsider, still not quite good enough. The room seemed to close in around her as she stepped out into the hallway. The cold air outside felt more biting now, and her mind raced with everything she had just experienced. It wasn't the first time she'd been overlooked. The first time she'd been doubted because of the color of her skin or her gender. But there was something different about this. Something deeper. This wasn't just bias, it was calculated, deliberate, and it had been building for years. And now, Jordan realized, it was time to do something about it. The minutes felt like hours as Jordan leaned against the cold, sterile wall in the hallway outside the briefing room. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. This wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination, but it was the first time she felt the weight of it so clearly and so maliciously. She had always known, deep down, that her path would be harder than others. She'd been told by her father that she would have to be twice as good to get half as far. But today, this had felt like more than just a test of her competence. It was a calculated move. They wanted her to quit. They wanted to remind her, in the most humiliating way possible, that she was not truly part of their world, no matter how much experience she had. 10 minutes later, the door to the briefing room opened. Instead of Barrett or Mitchell, it was James Harris who emerged. Looking uncomfortable, his eyes met Jordan's, and he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm sorry about that, Captain," he said softly. "I don't know what's going on, but I think it's complete nonsense." Jordan raised an eyebrow, a mixture of surprise and gratitude. James had been polite, but now she could see something else in his expression, a silent solidarity. "They said it was standard procedure for new captains. But I've been here for 3 years, and I've seen 4 new captains start. None of them were pulled from their first flight like this," James added, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's weird." Jordan nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She didn't need to be told twice that something wasn't right here. But she also knew she couldn't take the bait too quickly. These were dangerous waters, and every move she made now would set the tone for the rest of her career. "They want you to shadow Flight 340 to Denver," James continued, glancing around nervously. "It's a short hop. I'll be your first officer. And they've assigned Captain Logan to the flight. I don't know much about him, but His voice trailed off, uncertainty clouding his words. Jordan's heart sank. Captain Logan was known throughout the airline as one of the most senior, yet staunchly old-fashioned captains. If there was one man who had vocalized his disapproval of the airline's diversity initiatives, it was Logan. She'd heard stories about him, but never had the misfortune of flying with him until now. "Thanks for letting me know, James," Jordan said, her voice steady, though the anger within her simmered beneath the surface. She appreciated his honesty, but this was just another obstacle. Another test. "I'll take care of it. I don't want to cause any more trouble." But James looked at her, his expression full of empathy. "Captain, if you want to file a complaint, I've got your back. I know what's going on here. It's not right." Jordan's resolve hardened. A complaint on her first day would only paint her as difficult, especially in the eyes of those who had already decided she wasn't one of them. She had spent years fighting to be taken seriously, to earn the respect she deserved, and the last thing she needed was to be labeled a troublemaker. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I think I'll handle it another way. I'm not going to make any rash decisions yet." As James walked away, Jordan could feel the heaviness of the situation settling in. This wasn't just about one bad day or one bad captain, it was about a system. A culture. Something deeper and more insidious. Jordan spent the rest of the day shadowing Captain Logan on their flight to Denver. The experience was as uncomfortable as she had feared. Logan barely acknowledged her presence. And when he did, it was condescending, as if she were a rookie pilot instead of a senior captain with more flight hours than most of the crew combined. Logan's approach to flying was meticulous, but in the worst way. He treated every procedure like a formality, as if checking off boxes was more important than the safety of the passengers. During pre-flight preparations, he barked at the crew and acted as though every question from anyone but him was a nuisance. The entire flight, Jordan was treated like an outsider, and though her professional demeanor remained intact, she couldn't shake the growing sense of alienation. But there was something else gnawing at her, something more pressing than the small, passive-aggressive jabs Logan took at her. As they prepared for their descent into Denver, Jordan noticed something that made her stomach turn. Logan had entered the wrong frequency for approach control. A small mistake, but one that could lead to big consequences if not corrected. Without hesitation, Jordan spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Captain," she said, "I believe Denver approach is on 118.35 today. Not 124.75. For a moment, there was silence. Logan's shoulders stiffened as he checked the approach chart. "That's correct," he said, his voice clipped. "Thanks." Jordan didn't expect much more than that. A simple acknowledgement, but as they taxied to the gate after landing, Logan surprised her again. "You have a good eye," he said, his voice still hard, but begrudgingly respectful. Most people wouldn't have caught that. Jordan didn't respond right away. "Thank you, sir," she said finally, her tone polite but reserved. But then Logan added, "Don't get too proud of yourself. One good catch doesn't make you Meridian material. This airline has standards, traditions." The words were as sharp as a slap in the face. Jordan could feel her pulse quicken as anger began to boil in her chest. But instead of responding, she simply nodded. "Traditions evolve," she said, her voice unwavering, "and they have to." Logan didn't respond, but the message was clear. He wasn't interested in evolving. He wasn't interested in growing. And that, more than anything, made Jordan's blood run cold. As they returned to Chicago, Jordan was assigned to shadow different captains for the rest of the week, all men with similar outdated attitudes and a clear bias against her. But she endured it. She took it all in stride, knowing that she was collecting valuable information, data for the larger fight ahead. And as the days wore on, Jordan knew one thing for certain. Horizon Airlines had a deeper problem than she had initially realized. It wasn't just about individual captains or flight procedures. This was a culture of complacency. One that put profit over safety. That tolerated bias. And that discouraged those brave enough to challenge the status quo. She was about to bring it all down. But she needed to understand the full extent of it first. It didn't take long for Jordan to understand that the stakes were higher than she had originally thought. The small slights and passive-aggressive behavior of the captains she'd been shadowing began to form a larger, more disturbing pattern. The whispers she'd heard, the stories shared in hushed tones by some of the crew, started to make sense. Horizon Airlines wasn't just a company where she was treated as an outsider. It was a company that systematically overlooked safety, ignored critical issues, and, worst of all, punished anyone who dared to speak out. As much as Jordan wanted to ignore the sinking feeling in her gut, the evidence was undeniable. Maintenance records were being falsified, corners were being cut to save time, and too many of the aircrafts she flew were dangerously close to being grounded. The thought that one of these planes could fall apart mid-flight haunted her. But worse than that was the realization that there were people within the airline who knew this was happening, and did nothing to stop it. The tipping point came one evening when Jordan was preparing for a red-eye flight from Chicago to Las Vegas. As she reviewed the maintenance log, she noticed discrepancies, dates that didn't line up, checks that had been missed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern. A deliberate attempt to hide the truth. After the crew gathered for their pre-flight briefing, Jordan pulled aside her first officer, James, who had become one of the few people she trusted. She didn't want to go public with anything just yet, but she needed his support. James, she said quietly, I think there's something off with the maintenance logs. The intake valve inspections don't match up. Something doesn't add up. James looked around, making sure no one else could overhear them. You're not the only one who's noticed, Captain, he said, his voice low. A few others have seen it too. But no one's talking about it. They don't want to risk losing their jobs. You know how it is. Jordan nodded grimly. The culture of silence was what made this so dangerous. No one wanted to be the whistleblower. But she couldn't look the other way. If something went wrong, it wasn't just her career at risk, it was people's lives. She spent the next few days carefully documenting everything she had noticed. Her mind raced as she pulled together maintenance records, flight logs, and testimonies from the few crew members who had confided in her. It wasn't just about exposing Horizon Airlines anymore. It was about something bigger, about making sure no one else suffered because of the company's negligence. Jordan knew she had to act quickly, but she also had to be strategic. The aviation industry was small, and a whistleblower in her position wouldn't find many doors open to them afterward. But she wasn't afraid. She'd been underestimated her entire life. This was just another fight. One she was determined to win. She called her sister, Ava. That night, Ava was a lawyer, and she knew exactly what kind of trouble Jordan could be facing. She was also the person who would help Jordan navigate this treacherous path. I need your help, Jordan said, her voice steady but with a quiet urgency. I'm going after Horizon. I have proof of safety violations, and I'm ready to expose them. Ava didn't hesitate. I'll connect you with a friend at the FAA. You've got a solid case. Jordan, we'll make sure this gets heard. The next morning, Jordan went to the maintenance hangar. Under the guise of learning more about company procedures, she introduced herself to the ground crew, asking questions, trying to piece together what had been happening behind closed doors. Most of them were polite but distant. But there was one technician, Marcus Jefferson, who seemed to warm to her. He had grown up in Detroit, like Jordan, and they found common ground quickly. I've been working here for 23 years, Marcus said as he inspected the engine of a Boeing 737. Seen a lot of changes. Not all of them good. Jordan's heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Like what? She asked casually. Management's been pushing us to speed things up, Marcus replied. More flights, less turnaround time. Some checks that used to be mandatory, well, now they're at our discretion. They don't like delays, especially not with these big planes. Jordan's stomach twisted. She had known this was happening, but hearing it from someone who worked in the hangar, the place where all of Horizon's planes were maintained, was a whole new level of confirmation. Marcus lowered his voice. They're falsifying records. Big things. They want us to sign off on planes that aren't safe. Jordan's pulse quickened. She felt the weight of what he was saying. Can you prove it? She asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated. I can. But I can't be the one to stand up. I've got a family to feed. I can't afford to lose my job. Jordan understood. The system of fear was strong within Horizon. But she was determined to break it. She had to. For Marcus. For herself. And for the passengers who relied on them. Don't worry, Marcus. I'll handle it, she said, her voice steady with resolve. I'll make sure the truth comes out. You just stay safe. Before they parted ways, Marcus handed her a USB drive with flight logs, maintenance records, and internal memos. It was everything she needed to expose Horizon's negligence. But she had to be careful. This was only the beginning. And Jordan knew that the consequences of taking this to the authorities would be severe. That night, Jordan sat alone in her apartment, reviewing the evidence, the pictures from Lauren, the testimonies from James, and now Marcus's files. Everything painted a horrifying picture. Horizon Airlines was not just negligent. They were systematically putting lives at risk for the sake of profit. Jordan's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her career anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could change the industry for good. She knew the path ahead would be difficult. But it was the only one she could take. She couldn't look back. The weight of the decision settled heavily on Jordan as she reviewed the evidence one final time. The files from Marcus, the photos from Lauren, the accounts from James, and her own observations were all laid out before her. Each piece a damning testament to Horizon Airlines' reckless disregard for safety. The clock was ticking, and every moment spent in contemplation felt like another moment where lives might be at risk. But Jordan wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. She was fighting to make sure that no one else had to suffer under a system so deeply flawed. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Ava, as expected. The text simply read, I've made the connection. You know what to do. Jordan exhaled slowly. She had spent years navigating a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. But now the stakes were higher than ever. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for every pilot, every crew member, and every passenger who had ever trusted Horizon Airlines with their lives. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Ava had given her. After a brief conversation, a plan began to take shape. Jordan would report the safety violations to the FAA. But she would also send everything to a journalist at the New York Times who specialized in corporate accountability. If she was going to expose Horizon Airlines, she would do it on her terms, making sure the world knew what had been happening behind closed doors. The next morning, Jordan arrived at the airport feeling a sense of calm resolve. She knew what she had to do. And she wasn't about to back down. The moment she walked into the terminal, she could feel the eyes on her. The quiet whispers of her colleagues. They had all heard about her confrontation with Barrett and Mitchell, and now they were watching to see what she would do next. Jordan walked past them without flinching. Her mind focused on the task at hand. Her first officer, James, was already waiting for her by the gate. He gave her a quick, knowing glance, but said nothing. Jordan appreciated his silence. They didn't need to speak. They both knew that the situation was much larger than the two of them. And words were unnecessary at this point. As the day wore on, Jordan's mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Ava, to the reports she had filed, and to the text she had sent to the New York Times. She had already set the wheels in motion. But there was still one more thing to do. She needed to act quickly, before Horizon had a chance to retaliate. That evening, after the final flight of the day, Jordan received a call from Ava. It's done, Ava said, her voice sharp and confident. I've submitted the report to the FAA. They're already looking into Horizon. And I've sent everything to the Times. They're running with the story. Jordan felt a surge of relief. But it was quickly followed by a flood of anxiety. This was no longer just about her career. This was about holding the airline accountable for the lives it had endangered, and making sure that the truth didn't stay buried. The next few days were a blur of activity. Horizon Airlines issued a statement claiming that they were fully cooperating with the FAA's investigation. But Jordan knew the truth. The airline's glossy exterior was crumbling, and the rot within was now exposed for the world to see. The New York Times article hit the front page, detailing the company's systemic safety violations and the whistleblowers who had risked everything to expose them. The story spread quickly, sparking outrage among the public and in the aviation industry. At Horizon Airlines, executives were scrambling. They tried to downplay the situation, but it was too late. The FAA launched a formal investigation, and within days, nearly 40% of Horizon's fleet was grounded for urgent safety checks. Flights were cancelled, passengers were stranded, and the airline's stock price plummeted. The entire company was facing the fallout of its negligence. Jordan's role in bringing down Horizon Airlines was clear. The industry would never be the same. Whistleblowers were no longer seen as troublemakers but as essential voices in a system that too often overlooked safety in the pursuit of profits. Jordan had opened the door for others to follow. And though the path would be difficult, she knew it was the only way forward. As the weeks passed, Horizon Airlines filed for bankruptcy protection. Unable to recover from the scandal, executives were placed on administrative leave, and an independent safety audit began. The media covered the story extensively, and former employees came forward with their own tales of a company that had put corporate interests above human lives. But for Jordan, the fight wasn't over. She had been offered numerous positions at other airlines, all eager to demonstrate their commitment to safety and diversity by hiring the woman who had taken down one of the largest carriers in the country. But it wasn't just about the job offers. It was about the change she had sparked, the impact she had made. Months later, as Jordan stood in a small cafe across from Horizon's headquarters, she reflected on everything that had happened. The transformation had begun, both within the industry and within herself. She had faced down the very system that had tried to break her. And now she was standing tall, ready to lead the charge for a safer, more inclusive future in aviation. The sky belonged to all of them, and Jordan Edwards was going to make sure of it. As Jordan stood by the window, watching the planes take off one after another, a sense of peace washed over her. The journey she had undertaken, fighting systemic corruption, battling personal doubts, and challenging an entire industry's ingrained biases, had led her to this moment of quiet triumph. The skies, which once seemed so vast and intimidating, now felt like her true home. She had fought for safety, for justice, and for equality, and the ripples of her actions were still being felt, transforming the aviation industry one policy at a time. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Ava. The FAA just announced new safety protocols. It's happening, Jordan. The change is here. Jordan smiled, a soft sense of fulfillment in her heart. Her work wasn't over, but she had started something monumental, something that would continue long after her time at Horizon Airlines. As she made her way to the cockpit of her new airline, her eyes flickered to the horizon stretching before her, an endless expanse filled with possibility. The path ahead was still filled with challenges, but Jordan no longer feared them. She knew she was ready. She had always loved the idea of the sky, vast, open, and full of potential, and now, she realized, it wasn't just the sky that was endless. Her journey had only just begun. If you've enjoyed this journey and want to hear more inspiring life stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for new videos that will continue to inspire and empower you. Thank you for watching.